at his house at 101 Washington Street. The date is November 3rd, 1983. There. All right, Henry.
Mrs. Eccles and I came to Newport and moved into our home on Washington Street and Pine Street on the 15th of April 1947, when I started my 4-year tour of duty on the staff of the Naval War College. My brother, Willett, was the headmaster of St. George's School at that time, and that enabled me to have an entree to certain people and certain activities in Newport that otherwise I would not have had. When we came to Newport, while Washington Street was beautiful and had many very interesting and fine houses on it, the streets to the east of Washington Street, reaching to the railroad tracks, were in many instances badly run down, and there were small and larger houses in badly deteriorated condition, and these had been rented and sold and at very low prices. In these houses, there were many of them that were dated back to the 18th, and some as far back dated back to the 18th century, as well as many early 19th century houses. We saw great, and other people could see, great possibilities for the development of a more attractive environment on the point. And it was of great interest to us to watch the efforts of many homeowners of modest circumstances to improve their own houses. With that as a starter, we entered into our life in Newport. I, of course, was preoccupied by my work at the War College, and Isabel, who had always been active in the naval activities, the Gray Ladies, etc., during the war, and a Navy relief, became active in both of those areas here, both on the naval base and at the Naval Hospital, and particularly with the Naval War College Wives Club, which was just starting up. In the 4 years in which I was on the staff at the college, great changes took place in Newport. At that time, Newport had a reputation for having gouged naval personnel during World War II with very high rents, and that reputation stayed for some time. It was a very interesting situation in Newport with the torpedo station, which had employed as many as 13,000 people, having its manufacturing and torpedo overhaul activities closed down, largely because of the bad performance of the torpedoes built in Newport during World War II. That, of course, was a very controversial issue and caused great bitterness. The officers coming to command the Naval Torpedo Station on Goat Island were faced with a very difficult problem because of the dominance of the labor union, and the political influence of the labor unions, which meant that officers trying to improve the efficiency of the statement frequently found themselves in some difficult political circumstances. I had several friends who had difficulty along that line. But be that as it may, the gradual phasing down of torpedo station activities naturally had a considerable influence on the economy of Newport. And then it became obvious to anyone merely observing what was going on and reading the reports of what was going on at City Hall, we became aware that a very bad policy had been adopted by the city government of Newport during the days when the money was flowing into Newport in huge quantities. They kept the taxes unreasonably low, and instead of maintaining an adequate tax rate and paying and operating the city on a pay-as-you-go basis, which could have been done, they put even operating expenses at times were so arranged as to be handled by bond issues, with the result that the bonded indebtedness went up, the tax rate stayed low, and the old public utilities and city buildings deteriorated at an unreasonable degree, and no new facilities were built of any significance in that time. Well, that was the background with which I retired from the Navy in 1952, and from at that time I kept my association with the Naval War College, but I was working independently so that I had time for community activities, and I was elected to the vestry of Trinity Church, and I became, at the invitation and urging of Mabel Watson, Mrs. Harold Watson, I became associated with the Newport chapter of the American Red Cross. And in that capacity, I became active in fundraising. And from 19 52, 53 till my retirement from fundraising with the arranging the financing and raising the money for the acquisition and construction of Stora Park. In that period from 1952 to 1970, in the early 70s, I conducted or was active in 14 fund drives in Newport and the Diocese of Rhode Island. And that was a very enlightening experience. Sometimes a lot of fun, frequently dreadful headaches, and in any event, I was able to succeed in quite well in that work. And I learned a great deal about people and organizations, and particularly I learned the very casual way in which most volunteer organizations handle and report their administrative finances. I found very few financial reports in these worthy organizations that were understandable or made any sense. And all this by people with the best of intentions and good education. It just didn't seem to be a popular thing to be accurate and rigorous in financial accounting. Well, that was one aspect of my activities here. I also, a part of this fundraising was was for the Episcopal Diocese of Rhode Island, in which I conducted the first statewide every member canvas fund drive, and got to know the people in Providence and elsewhere. And through that initial work, and as my interest in the Episcopal Conference Center in Pascagoula, I became quite active in the diocese and served on the diocesan council for 7 or 8 years, and on the board of managers of the Episcopal Conference Center for approximately the same time, finally being the chairman of the board of managers for 5 or 6 years. With my work in Red Cross, I became a national vice chairman of fundraising in the Red Cross, and both with the Diocese of Rhode Island and the National Red Cross Organization, I attended certain seminars and weekend study groups on the techniques of fundraising, which was very helpful to me. But that put me in association with all kinds of people, and I became quite conscious of the various groups of people who constitute the citizenry of Newport, as described by Thornton Wilder. And all this was very informative and wonderfully educational for me. As to some specifics, I found one of of course, the most difficult work of that in that area was to get people to exercise responsibility, saying they would be willing to help you, but when getting down to the actual work of help, and many times you would be disappointed in people who allegedly were most enthusiastic. There was a very amusing remark was once made. I forget at what organization was meeting for the purpose of getting work done, and the chairman asked for volunteers, and this woman volunteered, and she said, oh, everybody thought that was fine. And when the specifics came down, she said, well, I'll volunteer to ask Mabel Watson to do it. Because Mabel was the great dynamo. She was highly intelligent, well-educated, an indefatigable worker, and a superb disposition, where she could work with all kinds of people, and even under the greatest of stress, she seldom, if ever, indicated her well-deserved exasperation. And Mabel was the great benefactor in volunteer organizations.
Great.
Then, in all these things, I would frequently address public gatherings. And when it became known that I could do pretty well raising money, there were plenty of opportunities. I got to know the politicians fairly well, and back in those days, it was obvious that Newport was an extremely dirty city. The people complained about it, and ideas were put forth, but apparently the attitude was such that there was no enthusiasm among the general populace for cleaning the city up. But as I became active, the city charter was revised, and while aware of the work that was being done, I had no part in that. But when they put it into effect, and the new form of government started with a ceremonial mayor and an executive city manager, the type we now have, the time came to select a city manager. And Maha was the first mayor, and there were some good people on the city council. But many of us were horrified when it was disclosed that the first city manager was to be a man named Gilday, who had no experience whatever in that type of work, his chief qualification being that he had been a parking meter salesman. And that roused, when the time came and the city council was to vote on this matter, I made my first public appearance in City Hall and got into a very active discussion with Mr. Maha and several others as to the desirability of this candidate. Well, he took over the job, and from then on it was a question, do the best you can with what you have and try to cooperate. Well, it was not long before some of the councilmen who had voted for him became disillusioned. But a council decided something really ought to be done about cleaning the city up. And so I was made the chairman of the city cleanup committee. And I drew up a plan of how to go about organizing the cleanup work in the city. And I went to see Gilday, and he was a very personable fellow. I liked him as a man. He was easy to work with, very decent guy. And I had one meeting with him, and we agreed on how to go about this basic work, because we both realized it was going to be a difficult job. And about 10 days after we had our first session, the city council decided they'd had enough of Mr. Gilday, so he got fired. And that was the end of my association with the cleaning up of Newport. I learned something from the job. I didn't do any good, but I got a bit more education. Then my next piece of civic education came when a very fine, experienced, public-spirited man who at that time was in his middle 80s, asked me if I would conduct a public meeting, preside at a public meeting that was being held in order to investigate the desirability and the manner in which it could be done of forming a taxpayers association in Newport. And the committee to do this thing had arranged for a very knowledgeable man with experience in the Taxpayers Association from Massachusetts to come down and address and discuss the techniques of the business of a Taxpayers Association at this public meeting, which was held at the Mary Street YMCA, and was attended by a very representative, fine group of citizens of Quidneck Island generally, and some of the most prominent and best and public-spirited citizens of Newport were there. And I remember J.T. O'Connell and Mr. William Lees and people with that prestige and association were there. I made my introductory remarks, and I knew some of these men on a very friendly basis, and I liked them and respected them. And in my introductory remark, I said, while I'd only been in Newport for 7 or 8 years at that time, I couldn't quite understand why, since the island of Aquidneck was a social and economic unit, it was divided into 3 political entities. And it seemed to me a lot of troubles would be solved if they consolidated politically. With that, a growl, literally like lions, came out of this group of senior citizens from these things, who were horrified at the thought that there could be any political cooperation and consolidation between the town and city governments on Quidneck Island. Well, I learned a good lesson then, and the Taxpayers Association went on, and I withdrew from after my initial job of conducting the first meeting on the thing. I joined it, but no longer took an active part. But that has the recollection of that amusing evening stays with me every year, and I don't intend to worry about that. About that same time, a lot of things happened in a period of 3 or 4 years. A succession of city managers came. The hurricane of '54 came. The Norman Bird Sanctuary was formed in Middletown, and Isabel and I were on at the invitation of Mr. William Drury, were on the initial board of advisors for the Norman Bird Sanctuary. The Preservation Society was formed in 1948, and of course their initial work was to acquire and preserve the Hunter House. Then the Point Association was formed by a small group of people on the point, and their history is quite thoroughly written up in the Green Light, so I won't go into that, except to say that as a fundraiser, as a member of Trinity Church Vestry and the property committee concerned with the real estate dealings of Trinity Church, and with the Point Association for various purposes, I frequently appeared in City Hall to explain some matter of interest, or as, of course, in the case of the Point Association, my final work with that there was the acquisition and development of Stora Park, which in association with the Redevelopment Agency, the Preservation Society, and the Doris Duke's Newport Restoration Foundation. And that entailed negotiations with city agencies and the city council, which in all of these I found a very cooperative and understanding attitude on the part of the council, the city council, the city officials, and this had generally it was a very rewarding thing, and it was the desirability of building Stora Park, particularly with the redevelopment of Goat Island there, was obvious to practically everybody. And aside from the usual problems of adjusting different concepts of design and things of that sort, the work went very smoothly on the thing. Well, this, of course, the whole city was tremendously affected by Hurricane Carol, which came on the 31st of August, 1954. And I was in my house on Washington Street throughout the whole Hurricane Carol, and it was certainly, I had been in some pretty bad storms at sea, but there's a great difference between being at sea and having things you can do in the way of maneuvering ship and things of that sort, and sitting on land over next to Narragansett Bay, where there isn't anything that you can do except hope for the best. Well, we were lucky, and we took no serious damage, and not too many trees went down. But the eye of the storm came over. I guess it came over just about Rose Island, I'm not sure. But it was really a very wonderful thing to see that eye come, and the bay calmed down. And then the wind switched around and it blew harder than ever, which is the typical way of the eye of a hurricane. But after that, I had been, with the Red Cross, I had been the disaster chairman for Red Cross. And so for the next few years, with every threat of hurricane, I would meet with a police car would pick me up about perhaps 2 o'clock in the morning, and we would go to the city command center, sometimes at the Viking Hotel and sometimes at City Hall. And I would sit there with a chart and a barometer and a radio and try and forecast what was going to happen to Newport, while the chief of police and chief of the fire department, public works, and several other officials, we sat around, ate sandwiches and coffee, and hoped for the best. And we were, on several occasions, we were very lucky. The storms coming close, but no storm doing anything like the damage at the Carroll did. Washington Street was flooded up to, it was about 2 feet deep at the corner of Washington and Poplar Street. And the result, or maybe only a foot deep there. And then we lived in the highest part of the point, so we were well out of it. But the people down the lower part of the point got really flooded. And I'll never forget a lot of cars parked out at the Long Wharf area, and the area which is now the Newport shipyard. And hour after hour, we could hear these horns, the automobile horns, blasting away until the batteries finally ran out. And then the people of Newport and the city officials and all the public utilities, the city workers and the public utility workers showed their best qualities in a disaster like that. It brings out the best in people. And they cleaned it up. We had a relatively low loss of life, not nearly as bad as hurricane, the 1938 hurricane, even though Carroll was probably a stronger storm than 38. But we had been warned and knew it was coming, and had been able to batten down to a considerable degree so as to prevent damage and evacuate people, whereas the 38 hurricane hit unexpectedly. And of course, when you get a hurricane at the mouth of a bay, the bay becomes a funnel. And the more water is blown in the bay, the further from the mouth of the bay, the higher it rises, because it narrows down. And you get a wide entrance, and gradually as you go north to Providence, it narrows down, and the water being blown up there rises as it goes up. So we would have, that storm would put 20 feet of water in the center of Providence, and the most we'd get in Newport would be 3 or 4 feet above the seawall. And some people don't understand that physical action of the funnel formation of the bay, or the mouth on the ocean, with all this water piling in and no place for it to go except up. and the further north it gets, the higher up it goes. Well, I stayed as disaster chairman for some time of the Red Cross and kept an eye on the jobs I had to do in disaster relief, which was interesting, but it interfered with your sleep a lot. Now I'll take a moment and pause.
Okay. Ron.
As time went on, the question of building the Bay Bridge came up, and there was great uncertainty in that the Navy officials in Washington took years to make up their mind as to what their position would be as to the construction of a bridge from Jamestown to Aquidneck Island, or whether or not it would even go to Jamestown, or whether it would be go from the area around in Portsmouth across to, or north of that, even north of that, to someplace near Quonset. But the Navy simply could not make up its mind in Washington, and that made it impossible for the commander of Naval Base here to take part fully in the discussion, because he never knew what his seniors in Washington were going to do. There was one project to build the bridge from Jamestown and land it where the proposal was made to land the bridge where the president of the War College has his house. The Navy didn't think much of that. And as a member of the board of the Point Association, I was appointed to represent the Point Association with the various people who were planning the combination of the redevelopment and the development of the bridge. At this time, to my astonishment, I found that there was no formal coordination between the redevelopment agency, the bridge authority, and the city council. They each would the highway department wouldn't take any real interest in redevelopment. The transportation authority didn't seem to give a damn about the redevelopment. And I could never, there was no one place that seemed to be actively coordinating the redevelopment, the bridge, and the highway system. They all seemed to be working independently. I couldn't figure that out, and still haven't been able to figure that out.
Can I interrupt you a minute, Henry?
Yes.
What was the thinking behind the bridge? Was it because at that point Newport felt it economically important? Were ferries outmoded? Was it a result of the economic situation where the torpedo station closed? Was this the beginning of the tourist bit, or?
It was to facilitate communication between Aquidneck Island and the roads to New York, both for heavy traffic and for passengers. The ferry, even with 2 ferries running, which was about the most they could accommodate, there would be inordinate delays, and terrific delays in downtown Newport, where they'd come up Mill Street.
Oh, I remember. Yeah.
And the fact that if you got to Jamestown after the last ferry, you had to go through Providence to get to Newport. But it was the whole development of the transportation system in this part of the country was involved in this. Well, that went on, and I was particularly interested in the connector highway for the development of the main highway, America's Cup Avenue, the Avenue of America's Cup, when that was designed as a major part of the redevelopment. And I made frequent trips to Providence, to the Department of Transportation, talked to the head of the department, his planner people, and they were coming up with all kinds of plans, but they couldn't get people in Newport to make up their mind what they wanted. And every scheme to improve the access to Newport and through Newport turned out to have major objection, and one or more groups would take an adamant stand on the subject. And I didn't have any personal expertise in highway design, and I was willing to go along with any two people who could agree. The problem was to find two people who agreed. But in any event, we finally came up with a plan. We did, I say we didn't. The authorities came up with this plan that I thought was as good as anything else. And it went along and finally seemed to be accepted by everybody. But finally, Ade de Bethune formed a very peculiar alliance with Mr. Bucci of the liquor store, which no one had anticipated, and they, this group, blocked the construction of the connector highway, which would have been the avenue coming off the bridge would divide, and one section would come down to Newport over the railroad tracks along that, and there was and another section cut across part of the point area going to Farewell Street. And there was all kinds of controversy over the thing, the feeling that the highway would divide the point and break up the social coherence of the point, which is a valid thing. And Ade had presented several plans, alternate plans. Of course, she's a very skillful designer, and she knows a lot. But the plans, one of the things was to bring the heavy traffic in over Quidneck Island, over Quidneck Avenue, and go build on the east side of Newport, out to the south end of Newport, open up a new area there. But that, of course, would cut through a great deal of very fine real estate. So that was never seriously considered. Well, finally,